let us begin. Thank you all for making the time today to have a little chat about the church. An unusual topic perhaps today. Some of you may be a little bit intrigued about the title of it. Let's speak honestly about the church. And I've kind of subtitled it Representing Reality in a World of Fake News and Foggy Language. Last year was my 20th anniversary of doing NCD ministry, and that's naturally quite a cause for reflection over time and to consider the kinds of things I've seen happen over that period of time, the things to celebrate, the challenges that have been there along the way. And I suppose one of the dynamics in the world in general that troubles me quite a deal, given that what we're involved in NCD is the attempt to bring an objective perspective about the health and state of the church. One of the troubling trends is the prevalence of what is called fake news, but more than that, especially in the context of the church, foggy language that tries to describe what's happening in church dynamics or what every church needs to become in language that in many respects is very, very unhelpful and very unclear and can cause significant anxiety for many people in the church. And a couple of instances of this have emerged for me recently as I've spoken with a couple of denominational leaders in movements that I've worked with in various ways over many, many years. In one instance, it was really quite an encouraging discussion at one level. We looked at the progress within this movement as we've worked with them nearly the whole time I've been involved in NCD. And we had some very early figures from back in 2004 that indicated where the overall health of that denomination was. And then I just last week produced a denominational report for them again. And we're able to track that across the nation. That particular movement had improved overall by about 8 points in NCD over that period of time. Now, there's always two ways I'm inclined to look at that. On the one hand, to say 8 points, that's fantastic, because there are very few other movements around that could say that as a collective whole, they have improved by that sort of degree over that period of time. And this is a reasonable size movement. And it's one of the few movements in their country that is actually a growing movement at the moment. So at that level, we can say, praise God, that's a wonderful situation to be in, far better than the opposite, going backwards in health and facing all manner of challenges. So one level we celebrate, but the other level I look at it and say, that's just terrible. That's over 16 years, that's half a point per year. That just feels like a glacier. That's so slow in terms of progress. And when you think of the millions and millions and millions of hours and many millions of dollars and the various resources spent over that time, you think surely we can do better than that. And in the context of this topic for today, I think of that movement in particular in terms of the lack of clarity or the fogginess of language perhaps that many of their leaders have had with respect to NCD and NCD principles. So not really speaking of it clearly, saying, well, NCD has some nice suggestions that might be somewhat helpful for your churches moving forward, which really doesn't say anything like what NCD claims to say. And so for the want of some better clarity to understand just how foundational the principles we talk about actually are, we could have seen significantly more progress. Now, to be fair, we've all been learning along the way, but hopefully for the next phase for that movement, there can be much better clarity and a much stronger message sent about just how critical these principles actually are for individual churches, for individual people, and for the whole movement. So that's one scenario. And then a secondary one was another movement that I worked with to a great extent, but less so in recent years. And this particular movement was the healthiest movement in its country at the time, experiencing significant growth, being looked at by many other movements and being inspired by them for their innovation, their ability to hold things together like really strong, passionate spirituality at the same time as really good, effective structures, very strategic and very passionate. So all these fantastic kind of combinations. But it was also a movement that was, like many, had some level of a 2020 vision, you know, so many, many years ago, looking forward to the year we're in right now and saying, where would we like to be? And they had, you know, certain dreams and visions about the number of churches they may have planted and the churches they may have and the attendance they may see, these various things. And so obviously in the early days, working with them from a health perspective, trying to say, well, they're the dreams you have. By all means, let's try to make those a reality by addressing, even though you're very healthy, let's address the issues that are potentially going to pull you back. And so over time, the sad thing was that in terms of fogginess of language and lack of clarity, they had a tendency to speak very positively about nearly everything, and in a very optimistic way, that you know, all of our dreams will come true and everything is happening wonderfully. So at the same time, as an NCD practitioner, having to speak into that to say, well, there are some little troubling signs. There are some areas that are starting to drop. It seems perhaps that you are focusing a little bit more on your own public relations speech and what you perceive about yourselves, and not so much about the actual critical issues under the surface. So the difficulty is that many times, if churches or movements are relatively successful, it can be more difficult to get them to focus on and recognize the you know, the dimensions of health that will help them sustain that progress and fruitfulness. So sadly enough, I ended up speaking just last week with one of the kind of national leadership people from that movement, and I hadn't connected with him for quite some period of time. And sadly enough, despite having landed in this 2020 vision year, they found themselves with the mother country for the movement having essentially plateaued, and that they're actually not growing as a movement. And so this was, in one sense, kind of vindicating news, because many years ago I'd tried to tell them, here are some of the concerns coming into the picture, creeping in there, and they weren't inclined to take as much notice, because at the time everything seemed to be very good. But now to see that they were starting to have difficulties was really quite sad, because the bottom line is that across such a movement, that's thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are now not part of the church, but they could have been part of the church. They could have been growing, coming close to Jesus, maturing in the faith, but for the want of some clear speech for such a movement to say, yes, we have some wonderful things to celebrate, but we have some very clear things that we need to address, and we can't let those go by. So with these sorts of scenarios, it challenges me to say, how do we help people to speak more clearly and to not be drawn into making grand statements or living a Facebook type life where you can present whatever persona you like. You can show all of the positives of life, and you can try to hide the harder parts of life. And the current world makes it very easy to curate and create a certain image of perhaps success that doesn't recognize or doesn't acknowledge the difficulties, and simply to view those things in a very balanced fashion. And then for myself as a practitioner, I'm saying, how can I speak more directly, which doesn't just mean negatively, it's speak directly about the things to celebrate and to be optimistic and positive about, but also to speak as clearly as possible about just how important it's going to be to deal with these issues. So it's obviously a little bit easier to do that now in the history of NCD, because we can refer to situations where not only churches, but whole movements, in essence, dropped the ball somewhere along the way and are now having to sort of come back to the principles and say, well, we've got some rebuilding to do because we didn't address these issues when they began to appear, and now we've slipped back and having difficulties. So that's very sobering. But the point is, we are all of us in this meeting are in a position to be able to draw upon those experiences in the NCD world and wherever we work with churches to be able to elevate the urgency a little bit more, speak a little bit more directly for the sake of people making better decisions and better informed decisions that won't potentially cause grief and heartache years down the track. The backdrop for me through all of this is really just going to Jesus' words in many respects and saying, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Not to be caught in the exaggerated language, not to be caught in the church context in our own marketing speak. I mean, it's sometimes sort of hilarious, but maybe a bit sad when I look through the NCD database and I look at some of the names that some churches give to themselves, which are very grand and kind of optimistic and positive names of hopefulness of what they will become, only to then have to look at their results that are nothing like the banner name they've given themselves as a church. So any newcomer that would come there would see the name and think, wow, what a wonderful place to be. But then to experience the health would be like disappearing to another planet in certain instances. So for the church to become a place where you can trust what is said positively and negatively, and to really know that amongst a world of fake news, at least when I'm either working in the church or someone coming to the church, this is a place where people speak in a sober manner and speak honestly about how life actually is. So that's part of what drives me in my discussions with churches these days is just let your yes be yes and your no be no, and be as clear as possible so that no one gets lost along the way. So today, I want to look at a range of NCD-related topics that could be presented much more clearly within the church. Some of these will be relatively familiar and it relates to a sharpening of the way it's presented. Some of them are somewhat newer, but the whole topic relates back to us being able to speak as honestly and clearly as possible so that people understand the implications of what they're involved in the church, and more specifically in addressing the health and development of the church. And because it's a range of different topics, I know from the outset that there'll be a big difference in the possible relevance for each of us with each different topic. So please don't look at these topics as being something to, my goodness, there's all these different topics to consider and to try to internalize. I'm very happy for you to look at any given one and say, oh, that's not important to me. It doesn't matter to me. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. But certainly what I am, I guess, asking is that, as we look at each topic, ask yourself, is this an area in which I need to speak more clearly and honestly when working with churches? Which is not to say about I currently speak dishonestly, but sometimes it's important to be a little bit diplomatic. Sometimes it's important to not be, and to make sure that the in a sense, prophetic voice of a person coming in, helping a church with NCD is at least making it very clear what is at stake and what needs to be addressed. As always, the presentation will be available for download afterwards, so you can chop pieces out of it and make use of whatever might be useful. So let's have a look at a few topics and then give you guys a chance to have a bit of a chat about some of them as well. So the first topic, and we're looking at the realities in every one of these instances. The realities behind hope is one of the first points I want to look at. And this has emerged out of the current work that we're doing on developing the inspiring worship discipleship tool within the NCD toolkit. So through the course of this year, we'll move to the research phase, and hopefully you'll all get to know about that. And then we'll have this tool, which will help people. It's very difficult to have an inspiring worship service unless you have inspired and inspiring worshipers. So the whole idea is to help worshipers become better, healthier worshipers to improve the worship services. So the kind of three colors of worship, if you like, in this context, are these ideas of teachability, discipline, and humility, all as critical ways to bring the reality of God's kingdom into focus, and to ultimately, whenever we are engaged in worship, to see God more clearly and in a more centered way within our life. So each person will have a tendency in these directions. And as usual with the 3-color scheme, the idea is to grow and become radically centered with each area. Beyond that, we have these 6 kind of worship postures or forms of worship that expand and elaborate on those 3 central areas. You know, the searching worshiper, steadfast worshiper, sacrificial, grateful, surrendered, wonder-filled. And these are, again, areas where people will have a greater strength as a starting point in their approach to worship, but always the implication is there'll be something missing or something a bit distorted in your approach, in this case to worship, if you neglect some of these areas. But in this current context, I just want to focus in on a particular pair, because each of the opposite pairs here. Oh, sorry, Gary.
Yeah, say Adam, if I can step in.
Yes.
There's some chats coming in the chat box, and it looks like there's consensus. 2 things. There's a gray box that's over your slide.
Okay.
And then also your slides don't seem to be advancing. We just still see the first slide. So if you've advanced it, we're just still on the first slide, Adam.
Oh dear. Okay. That's very unusual. I've never seen that before. So let me try to get a little bit lateral with how to solve that. All right. Let me just go back in here and see. Are you seeing the 6 areas around the outside?
Yes, the slide with worship in the center, realities behind hope.
Yes, yes. And then with wonder-filled, searching, and these terms around the outside?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Well, I'll try advancing after this one, and please do let me know if it's not advancing. I might have to go a little bit lower tech. Yeah, so anyway, here are these areas. Sorry, that must have been very hard to take in without anything visual there. Yeah, so we have these components of worship, but what I'd like to focus in on is just one of the pairings from here that helps us understand this topic of hope. Okay, so I've just advanced that. Are you now seeing nothing advanced? Excellent. All right, wonderful. All right, let's go a bit lower tech and see if I can. Sorry about this. I've never had this happen before, so.
And it looks like it may be that we see a box with pencil. Oh, there, now it's gone. That might have been the box, that pencil box. Okay.
All right, I might just try one more time coming into that page there. So you can see the searching could be better, could be worse.
Hope with the arrows going up and down.
Okay, lovely. So what we have here is, this is kind of like a hope continuum. So one of the components within the context of a life of worship is the enhancement of hope. And so as part of our work as NCD practitioners, and then within the lives of leaders within the church, an important part is that we are fostering hope, and we're called in the Bible to give a reason for the hope that is within us because of the importance of hope to drive things forward. And in this context, we have these 2 aspects where the searching worshiper has a general approach of saying that things could be better. So you go in search of things because you believe things could actually be better. And on the other side, you have the grateful worshiper whose kind of mindset is that, well, things could be worse. And given that things could be worse, I'm conscious of many things to be grateful for because I can imagine in very specific ways what could be worse or how things were worse before in many respects. And so when it comes to our work with churches, to be sure that and each of us will have our tendencies. So I'm more of a searcher. There are some people who are more grateful. So when I work with a church, the danger is that I will go too heavily and too quickly, directly to the minimum factors. And suddenly people are saying, wow, that's really interesting, but we all just feel depressed. And so it's not, entirely helpful if that's an imbalanced picture, because one aspect of hope is being brought to them, but on the other side, there are other things that would help bolster them and give them greater hope. So for me personally, to spend a healthy, balanced amount of time on the things to be grateful for, which could be just the strengths they already have in a first profile, or it could be that they've made some progress. It could be any number of specific things that have been little breakthroughs in the life of the church. So to spend time being grateful about that, and then to help the leaders themselves to be very clear about the points that need to both be celebrated in a grateful sense and searched for. Now I'm going to attempt to advance the slide again. Does this now have a black circle around it? All right, I'm going to have to just snap out each time with this. Okay, so this won't make complete sense because the animated parts won't quite work, but in any case, hopefully you can see the black circle with overwhelmedness and obliviousness there on the screen. Yes, lovely, thank you. Okay, so as with all of the compasses, it's one thing to be in balance towards one direction and needing to grow in the other direction, but always there is a sickness, there is something actively destructive that comes about from imbalance. So if we imagine that, have to imagine it, the yellow circle moving upwards where you're focused much more on the searching side, then it's all very good and well that we're searching, but the problem is that that can bring about an environment of people simply being overwhelmed and paralyzed and so struck with all of the things that we need to fix and resolve and sort out that their hope ends up being diminished. They start feeling more hopeless than as opposed to hopeful because of that upward imbalance. But equally, if, as I referred to with that movement earlier on, all of the talk is of what we're grateful for and what's going fantastically, and there's almost no talk of what needs to be resolved, then we have this strength in gratitude, but it then leads to an obliviousness where there's just no recognition of the fact that there are things breaking down, there are things going wrong, there are difficulties taking place. So we can see that it's not just a matter of, some will choose to be searching, some will choose to be grateful. There are downsides attached to each direction that we need to take very seriously. So to be aware in our own coaching that if we are very positive and optimistic, we may be in danger of leaving people a bit oblivious to the waterfall they're about to row their boat over the edge of. Equally, if we focus on the searching, they can end up very overwhelmed. And to help the leaders, because sometimes you'll come in wanting to encourage a church and then you discover that the pastor is very melancholic, very kind of down searching sort of person. To help them understand if the process is going to keep moving forward, they're going to have to speak more about things to be grateful for and to balance out in that way, because hope will only be built if the two sides are there. And equally, you will have certain people in the process who won't even engage if they're not hearing one or the other side. So you'll have some people who are focused and really searching and wanting their church to become a much better place. And if they're not hearing really honest talk about the issues that need to be resolved, then you've lost them in the process. They don't really want to engage. And equally, those who are more grateful oriented, if they're not hearing what's already going well, hearing about that, and that's being celebrated, then they'll tend to disengage. So this is one area that is useful for each of us. As I say, in this coming year, we will have the overall tool available for each of us to be able to look at our tendencies and to help others to see their tendencies with respect to not only this hope area, but other areas related to this worship paradigm. So this is simply to highlight and raise the question, do you need to sharpen and clarify how you speak honestly about a given church you're working with respect to searching, with respect to what to be grateful for? So I'll leave that one for you to consider. All right, we will see if we can move on in a low-tech fashion and advance somewhere here. Okay, so what we have here is a chart that some of you will have seen from a previous webinar I've done, and I believe Christian's also featured it in one of his webinars. And this is some recent research that we have explored. And in this context, I want to look at the realities of sickness and health. So we simply revisited what work we'd done many years ago in terms of the relationship between the annual average growth rate of churches and the level of health that those churches have. So from left to right, we have the level of health being the lowest possible end of the NCD spectrum, and the right-hand side being the highest level of the health spectrum for NCD. And so the lighter green line points to the state of play prior to 2008. And so we had the first thing that's very clear is that there is a very strong correlation between the health of a church and the likely growth of the church. So at one end, you've got decline at an average of 2.79%. At the other end, you've got growth at an average of 19.27%. So a very strong correlation between those areas. However, our post-2012 sample of this shows a different picture. Now, the significance of these timeframes, and the most important part to note is what we're trying to look at here is what is life like in the church post social media, the likes of Facebook, YouTube, these massive social media dynamics that have thoroughly changed the way that people interact, to the point where you will sit down and see people in a coffee shop meeting with each other, but communicating on their smartphones while sitting with each other. These are dramatic changes in the way people connect. And the simple fact that a poor average Pastor Joe who has just this week done 4 funerals and a wedding, and then has had almost no time to prepare a sermon, has to get up and prepare this wonderful sermon, knowing that his people during the week were able to quickly dial in on YouTube and listen to 4 different sermons by the greatest preachers the world currently has. And so those dynamics are enormous shifts in the way that people engage in church life. So the question is, and what makes many people nervous, is the whole issue that is the church fundamentally different now? Do we have to kind of throw everything out and completely change the way things are? And so there are a lot of churches with a certain nervousness, and then that naturally feeds into the question, well, NCD was around before that time frame, so perhaps it's irrelevant now. Perhaps we've got different principles we need to be looking at. Well, what this chart clearly indicates is that addressing health, contrary to even what is said in some parts of the missional church movement, that we're now in the post-church health phase of church development, which is one of the most mind-boggling statements I've read in recent times from high-level authors in the church context. But the notion that somehow we're past a phase where the health of the church matters, absolutely extraordinary. But I don't know what that means, but anyway, these are some of the things and the fogginess of language that is in the church environment now that we have to be addressing as NCD practitioners. But what we can see from this chart is that there are the strong correlation between health and growth of the church remains very much so, is in fact even stronger in terms of the implications from one end of the spectrum to the other. But what's extremely noteworthy is that if you are a church in the lower health categories, what's at stake in terms of addressing church health is more significant now than it was even at the time of NCD's beginnings. So for a church at the lower end of the spectrum, the principles we talk about are even more urgent, even more important to address. So we constantly face in NCD this challenge that most programs and processes in the church are relatively short-lived. So people don't expect anything to last very long. And so when I meet up with people after many years and they say, oh, how's NCD going? Oh, yeah, it's still going. We're still doing all the same things. Often they're quite surprised because they're not used to anyone having said something at one point in history, and then suddenly they discover that they're still saying exactly the same things many years later. So we have this difficulty where we have to keep coming back to people saying, I'm sorry, but the 8 quality characteristics are still important. In fact, for many churches, even more critical now than they were in the early stages. So that's one point I encourage you strongly in the way that you're speaking to people about NCD and the principles is to not be backing away from that, but be pushing that even further forward so people have it very clear. Because as we can see on this lower end, the likelihood of decline or of slower growth is certainly there. Now, if we only had that part of the chart, we might think, well, perhaps the whole world is changing. Perhaps we do need to change everything about the church. And sure, there's always things we need to reform and address the health and do things differently. That's absolutely a given. But if you took some of the more recent understanding of things, you would almost take it that everything has to be completely changed and turned on its head, which causes a lot of people in church life and ministry to become quite unsure of themselves and lose a lot of confidence in the very things they're doing. But this is where we turn to the right part of the diagram here, where the astonishing thing is that the growth rates are almost the same as they were in that earlier phase. And the point here is that if you are actually bringing to the surface and making visible the principles and life of the kingdom of God to a greater extent, it doesn't much matter that in this time we've had this unbelievable social media upheaval throughout the world. We had a global financial crisis. We have all manner of things going on in terms of gender identity and various things that have not really been part of the world. There's all sorts of turbulent things happening in the world, but very healthy churches just continue to do what they do and provide a place where people experience God, they grow in maturity in Christ, all of the things that are characteristic of Jesus' church. And so the point is that the principles are the principles are the principles. And this is why I've put this sand and rock thing underneath, because it can end up sounding a little harsh. And so I'm not saying all these things should be said to every church the first conversation you have, but at certain points where you need to make it clear the importance of what we're talking about here. And sometimes to say, in effect, what we're saying is that churches at the lower end of the spectrum are built on pretty much sand. That's what it's like. And you put a little bit of a breeze in there, a little bit of turbulence, a few different factors in life, and their ability to withstand the storm is not very strong at all. They are very, very fragile. Whereas if you're building on the rock, and in our terms, this is the rock who is Jesus, and the principles that are the principles of the king within the kingdom, and the way things work, then you have a much greater capacity to weather those storms and to not have to become obsessed with whatever's changing around us in the world. I mean, the world has been turbulent forever in a sense, but you would almost think that by media reports, suddenly everything's more turbulent than ever before. Well, yes, there is turbulence and there are significant changes, but the principles remain the same. So I encourage you in this context to do what you can to try to help churches to understand really what's at stake here. In NCD, we're not offering a few interesting or helpful ideas to move your church forward. We're simply saying these are principles that you have to acknowledge whether you like it or not, because if you don't, there will be significant negative implications somewhere down the track. As I said earlier, we can see that now in many churches who have dabbled but not seriously addressed the minimum factors, and we can see this in multiple movements who are now somewhat on their knees saying, boy, we really wish that we'd taken more notice in the earlier years and taken this more seriously, because we are now facing the kind of problems that were, in a sense, forecast in the earlier stages. Yes, so there's another one to consider. Moving on, and in a moment, we'll just give a chance for you guys to have a little bit of a chat around some of these things and perhaps share some of your own experiences that may relate to some of these points. But this next one, now this profile here, this picture comes out of the NCD Result Guides report, out of the summary guide there, where we take the quality characteristics and we relate them to these three kind of relatively ancient categories of fellowship, service, and faith. And added to that relatively recently, we've added in this other dimension that is proving to be a very helpful summary. You can take the 8 quality characteristics and kind of boil the picture down, not in every context, but in many contexts, down to these 2 categories that are talked about, you know, opening the front door in church life, inviting and sending people. And then on the other side, closing the back door, embracing and growing people. And that's quite common language in church leadership discussion or church development discussion. And so to be able to see the affinity that each of the characteristics has with each of those areas, it can prove to be quite helpful. But the reason I'm putting this up is I'm speaking at a conference this weekend related to this particular movement. And it's challenging because the conference itself is about community engagement. And not surprisingly, because that's the kind of heading that a strong need-oriented evangelism evangelical movement would want to talk about. Even though it's already their strength, they're always wanting to talk more about community engagement. So as usual, I have to go in there as the Grinch and talk about some of the realities that they need to address that are actually not their favorite topics. But as many of you know, you get used to that in NCD ministry, the bearer of the more sobering news. But I put this here primarily to just speak into one topic that emerges a lot in discussions about the current state of the church and what needs to be addressed. And that is, you'll hear in many places, not all places, but many places, you'll hear the church simply needs to become more outward focused. And on the face of it, that sounds very noble and sounds very missional and all of these sorts of things. The problem is it's just simply not true in about half of the churches we ever work with in NCD. So, and this is a case in point. It's precisely because this movement at the moment is significantly outward focused that it has the problems that it has. Because what happens if you are an outsider? Well, in this, you can actually imagine this as this picture, almost like a house, whereby the front door is at the bottom of the page and the back door's at the back. So you enter in that front door and there's lots of hands reaching out, shaking your hand and welcoming you and saying it's great to have you in the house. So you're in the foyer of the house. But then once you're in the foyer, there's a hallway behind that. And all the different rooms and bedrooms and living areas are off to the side of that hallway. But in this context, you walk in, you're greeted at the door, and they're very happy to see you. But once you enter the house, you begin walking down the hallway. Unfortunately, because loving relationships is not strong, there's not many people coming out of the other rooms of the house to invite you in to be part of the family or to invite you into an empowering leadership collaboration discussion to work as a team and figure things out together. So when you walk into such a house, the only place you're going to finally end up is at the back door. Now, hopefully you won't end up going out the back door, but if no one has embraced you or connected across with you on the way, it's going to be a problem. And once you talk to such groups, you find out that yes, they have many of their own stories, tragic stories, where their own children are not part of the church, or good friends they had are no longer there. And many, many people are away from them now, precisely because for a season of time, they neglected the inner focus, the consolidation and growing of the fellowship. Now, one of the most obvious problems with purely in this context, having an outward focus, is that the people you want to reach on the outside, if they are convinced by the gospel, will soon be inside. So if they were outside and then they're inside, then suddenly they're facing a real challenge. In fact, for many of them, they feel like they've just gone and visited a different planet, because when they were outside, they were loved to bits and they felt, you know, this huge warmth from the church. The moment they stepped inside, suddenly it became a bit icy and cold. And so for two main reasons, you need to have this look on the inside. One is that you want people to actually be wrapped up in the fellowship and become part of a family and have that opportunity for healing and all of the sorts of things that can come from that. But even if your primary interest is on the outside, the outreach components of church life, you're still doing yourself a disservice by not focusing on these more inner dynamics, because you're losing a lot of your potential workforce. So we're to pray to the Lord of the harvest for workers from the harvest. But if those workers come in and then we don't embrace them, we don't collaborate with them, we don't develop them, we don't work with them, then the very workers that you so much want to be going out the front door to engage with the world are being lost out the back door. Now, of course, all of this applies in reverse in certain churches. There are churches that very definitely need to have a greater outward focus. But it depends very much on the profile that they're looking at the time. So simply because this is a topic that emerges and it's part of what I put in the category of the foggy speak of the church itself. It's another area that we can speak into very clearly and definitively, because the more kind of simply unhelpful or foggy or just plain nonsense talk that we can move out of the picture, the more we can help people focus on the issues that actually are most important in the given context to see churches become healthy and to make progress. So we've looked at three topics just here as a starting point. So the realities behind hope, the searching and grateful, and balancing ourselves out and helping leaders to balance out to make sure they're representing the reality of hope there. Realities of sickness and health in terms of the implications of the increasing implications of addressing or not addressing the health of your church or your congregations. And then we've just looked at the inward and outward realities related to church life and the need to recognize in each given context, do they need a season of somewhat more of an inward focus to nurture and develop and foster the fellowship of the church? Or in fact, do they need a very clear, renewed outward focus as a church? So with those in mind, I'd just like you to sort of pick one that maybe stands out a little bit more for you, that you're more familiar with, or even feel a little bit convicted by in your own approach. And I'd just like to, I guess, put you guys in some little discussion breakout groups for just a few minutes to share a little bit about that and maybe some of your experiences around that area. Hopefully everyone is back now. Hope you got to know each other a little bit and share a little bit of your experiences with these topics we are exploring.
Adam, you are a Zoom rock star. That was my first Zoom breakout, and I am just like,
okay.
Sorry, I just had to share that little affirmation with you for a minute. Great, love it. Can't wait to use it with some people.
I was thinking, man, you need to get out more.
Well, you know, how many hours behind am I? Multiplied, right? Anyways, I'm sorry. I'll mute my mic now. Go ahead.
That's great. Thanks for the feedback. All right. Now, in the meantime, I've done some research and hopefully I might have solved our slide problem as well. So please do let me know how we go with that. All right. I'm trying to do something magical in advancing a slide. Do we have a slide that says principles on it? No. Excellent. All right. Well, that was a complete failure. All right. Do we have a slide with principles on it now? All right. I'm not convinced it will improve beyond that point. Do we have a yellow bar chart on the screen? No. Excellent. Wow. Someone hates me. Never mind. I'll recover. All right. Let's try this low-tech version.
So Adam, I have a question.
Yes.
After these failed attempts, you're using the word excellent. What does that mean?
It's a suppression technique. It's my attempt to be grateful rather than just searching endlessly.
There you go. What's reality?
That's what's reality anyway. That's right. This is fake news. This is all excellent. Wonderful. What I'm trying to depict here is that we have hopefully you can see a bar chart and models and principles and things now. Yes? Wonderful. Great. Something works. Principles. So we have, of course, the quality characteristics that we're all completely familiar with, and the clarity of speech in this context relates to a couple of different areas. And one of them is tied to what I was referring to before about the simple foundational nature of the principles that we talk about, the 8 characteristics related to church life. And as you can see here, I've written something relatively intense. That is that the principles will crush you if you defy them. Now, I know Neil Adams is connected into the meeting and he'll have a fair idea what this relates to and who I've been reading in a sense to get this clarity. But the important point is that sometimes people will get the impression that the quality characteristics, well, if you don't necessarily engage with them, well, things won't go quite so well. If you do engage with them, things will go somewhat better. And that's a very mild, watered down understanding of it, not only because the extent of the difference that can happen in your own life or in the lives of a whole congregation is dramatically larger than that, but it goes much deeper. It's not just that these things sit at an optional level, and particularly in the West, we don't have a very good understanding that if you have an essential area that you don't apply, it's not just that it will be missing. If you have an essential area you don't apply, you will be actively creating some other problem. There will be very concrete issues festering and developing as a consequence of that lower area. Not just that they already are some areas, you will continue to create more and new and creative problems and diseases and dysfunction as a result of those lower areas. And that's because of the very nature of principles being that they operate whether you like it or not. So if you bring your congregation or your own life in line with those principles, things will generally trend upwards. Things will go better. Things will be far less forced. If you don't bring things in line with that, you will suffer the consequences. And I've been reiterating this through this presentation, that we are at a point now where we can see, sadly, in quite a lot of instances, where churches or even whole movements began addressing the principles, but simply kind of dropped the ball or got distracted or moved in some other direction. And now we're having conversations with increasing numbers of the same ones saying, my goodness, we have to, before all is lost, we have to come back and start looking more seriously at these things and really digging into that, because they are beginning to be somewhat crushed by the reality of those principles and the fact that you cannot disregard them. And so this is really part of what we can include in our discussion and what we present as practitioners much more than before, because the evidence simply mounts up, just as the evidence of great progress and transformation, mounts up as well. The evidence of the other side is also there. So that's one layer of this. But the secondary layer relates to this models layer. So anyone has engaged with the NCD original books, knows this difference between principles and models. Now, models can be related to all manner of different things. I've just given a few examples of model-like activities, programs, strategies, action plans, manuals, training materials, etc. So the nature of a model is it's specific to a particular context. And the critical factor that comes into this is that the model must complement and bring to life the principle layer. If I just draw that out a bit, it's very common that you'll work with a church and they'll say something like, oh, we're not really looking at NCD at the moment because we're focused on, a purpose-driven life or the Alpha program or something else. Now, the problem is that that's a category confusion. They're not even the same thing. They're on different shelves in the library. So it's saying we're not focused on pears at the moment. We're focused on the color green. It's like, well, that doesn't really make any sense. But and we need to be able to speak into that, to say that the principles in and of themselves will not specifically tell you anything that you have to do in the context of your church in concrete terms. It just won't. Now, yes, the tools and the various things we add to that will draw that out and give you suggestions and prompt you in those directions, but they won't in and of themselves tell you exactly what empowering leadership needs to look like in your context, in the exact actions in the everyday. So with that layer underneath, that rock layer, if you like, the foundation that sits there, it has to be acknowledged or things will go badly, full stop. But on top of that layer, it's essential that you do develop the model of your church. You have to, because your church is a model church. It's a specific instance of the church in a particular context with unique people and unique opportunities and all those sorts of things. So it will automatically become a model. It's just whether it will be a healthy one or not. That's the only thing in question. And so the critical factor is that when churches develop strategies and programs, that the typical problem is they will usually develop them in areas often related to their maximum factor because they like it and they enjoy it. So that's why they want to be developing these sorts of things, because it's their favorite thing to do. So this goes to the issue of when we speak to churches sometimes about, we need to get them out of their program mindset. Now, I myself used to sort of say that kind of thing, but there was something didn't quite make sense to me about it, because there's an awful lot you can achieve with a particular plan with certain steps and certain activities that are joined together and people get engaged in that. Well, that's basically a program. That's what it is. And some people are very good at developing programs. The problem has always been not with programs themselves, but the program mindset that many of us have perhaps counseled against is that it's a program mindset focused on maximum factors. So areas you're already good at, that's what doesn't work about it. And so if a local church, if they've got a group of people who like developing programs and putting things together, and you can help them understand that this lower layer needs to be acknowledged and that whatever you develop needs to respond to this principal layer, then if they develop a program that helps them develop their holistic small groups, all we should be doing is singing hallelujah and saying hooray. Now, there'll be many other things that they will do that are not quite as programmatic along the way. But we lose a big part of our workforce if those people perceive NCD as this weird abstract thing where you're not really allowed to do programs and activities because it's all sort of principle based, whatever that kind of means in practical terms. So they get a little bit lost on the way. Whereas if we can unleash some of those people and say, by all means, write a program and make it quite prescriptive if you like, that's fine, as long as it's contextualized to your environment. It is your own program based on your unique model of the church, and it's completely coming out of what the principal layer tells you need to be addressing. So I guess this is one probably much more for the clarification of the way we speak as NCD coaches and practitioners, to make sure that we're not in a way telling people not to do things that would actually be very, very helpful for them to do, and to clarify our own language around these areas, that models are clearly not bad. We wouldn't even know the principles if we hadn't been able to study models. It's just that each church will be a model, and we don't want anyone to copy another model, but by all means learn from many different models, because that's how NCD itself came about, by abstracting the learnings from lots of models around the world to say what principles are underneath these different models. So again, I just offer that as something that I've tried to clarify a bit in my own language and communication, because we want to tell people that NCD is not prescribing for you what you must do. Once you understand your results, you need to get creative and to make up things. And I can only help you so much as a coach, because I don't even know your church that well. But if you know your own people and you know the kind of programs and strategies, or the way you do your maximum factor stuff, well, let's just take those skills and apply that to your minimum factor, so that you are able to do something very practical in advancing your church along the way. All right, let's jump across to another category here. And again, disappointing to not have the animations, but so this relates to the survey cycle. So on the right-hand side, they're just the standard sort of NCD survey cycle. And in that context, if we just start in the perceived corner, perhaps, people complete surveys based on their perceptions of church life. Those surveys go into a calculation system that compares them, sort of objectivizes the whole thing to calculate results in the understand phase, helping people simply understand the results, the strengths and weaknesses. And then in the prioritize or plan phase, we apply the minimum factor principle. We focus in and prioritize on what matters most. In the do stage, we do the stuff that's a priority. And the experience stage, we go beyond that doing and allow God and others to do more stuff beyond that. So that's, a general thumbnail sketch of what ideally all churches are doing as part of that cycle. But one thing that struck me lately is in many respects, similar to talking about the sand and the rock and some of these areas, we in NCD, we have some parts where we have relatively abstract terms, and sometimes that's very important because we have to communicate to lots of different types of churches with different theological backgrounds and different language. So abstract terms are not the worst thing, but they can be a little bit bloodless and a little bit sort of dry. And it may be certain instances where capturing other terminology is very, very valuable. And so it has occurred to me relatively recently that the application of the minimum factor has a very strong affinity to the Christian notion of sacrifice. Now, sacrifice, a definition from a dictionary, an act of giving up something valued for the sake of something else regarded as more important or worthy. And typically sacrifice therefore involves some degree of suffering as well along the way. But an important part out of this that I want to make a distinction with is that if we take this classic verse from Hebrews, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. So, you know, Christ suffered immensely, but this was not some kind of pointless suffering. It was not suffering for its own sake. Even for him, not just for us, but even for him, there was some greater joy beyond the cross that was to be experienced. So the notion of just somehow doing purely selfless sacrifice doesn't actually make sense in the context of a community where you're connected with people. So Christ wants to be in deep relationship with us. So for us to be saved is something of great joy for him that is at the end of the horrors of experiencing the cross. And so sacrifice is not even then a specifically Christian notion. Anyone who's ever reached the highest points of their given field of work or study or sport or anything is a person who has sacrificed in the short term and suffered in some way for some greater gain, something more important beyond that particular sacrifice. And these are all traits that relate to the minimum factor strategy, because to address your minimum factor to some extent is to undergo some degree of suffering, if it's for no other reason that you just don't often like it. So most churches don't particularly like their minimum factor. And so there is some degree of suffering and sacrifice involved in addressing that. But rather than leaving it in the abstract language of minimum factors, to, in some occasions, draw it across to the well-established notion of Christian sacrifice can be very valuable. And this ties in, of course, and Christian Schwartz has written about this in numerous books about these dynamics of whoever gains their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for my sake will find it, which is again outlining the general principle of sacrifice. That is, certain things are put to death so that other things will live. And even within your own life, you put certain things to death in the Christian journey so that there is greater life experienced. So in the minimum factor principle, there are things where we say we are willing to put to death certain things in ourselves, certain things that we want to hold on to but must release or relinquish, so that the greater good, that is the overall health of our church and the number of people who are likely to be saved, and et cetera, is experienced. And so rather than just this dry methodology, scientific sounding thing of minimum factor, the notion of sacrifice seems to fit very well. If we just expand a little bit further, applying the minimum factor principle is a call to sacrifice in one sense, to taking up your cross. If we talk in Christian circles about taking up your cross as part of the Christian life, many people can think of instances or decisions or moments in life where they had to take up their cross and experience some suffering for the purposes of Christ or the kingdom. But for most, what does it mean in really practical terms every day for me to be sacrificing and taking up my cross? And that's often a much more difficult thing to understand, but it should be the natural part of the Christian life. And the point about relating the minimum factor principle as as a component of what we understand in sacrifice means that we can put aside irrational suffering in the church that is so often passed off as genuine sacrifice. Let me explain what I mean by that. You have a pastor whose life is this life of sacrifice and suffering, who works very long hours and pastors all of the people and takes on this very burdensome load and is really appearing to be sold out for the purposes of Jesus and the church. The problem is, in our terminology, we'd say quite possibly that pastor has a minimum factor of empowering leadership. And so the suffering being experienced is not what you would want to honor by calling genuine Christ-like sacrifice. It's irrational suffering. It's not suffering that is based on the principles of God's kingdom. It's because of living against the principles of God's kingdom that suffering is taking place. The same as a person who perseveres in children's ministry year after year and really can't stand children. They're not very good at it, and they just keep going because it feels like this is my sacrifice for God. And it's simply that gift-based ministry has never been applied. And so their suffering is irrational. The children's suffering is irrational. Everyone is suffering needlessly because instead there needs to be a sacrifice made to say, well, I need to sacrifice my identity as a person ministering in pain all the time, and instead accept the spiritual gifts that I've been given and to live that way. And so in each case, there's a sacrifice to be made. One more example. We dutifully attend the worship service every week, and it's a painful experience because the preaching is really not very good at all, and it's boring, and it doesn't seem to be very helpful, but it's important in our devotion to God that we do that. It's part of our duty and service. Again, it's irrational suffering because it's completely defying principles and elements of inspiring worship that should relate to relevancy of preaching and making sure that people who are gifted are actually preaching and making sure that it's actually the truth from the Bible, etc., etc. And so in that context, maybe an elder in the church needs to make a sacrifice of their own likability or popularity by going to the pastor and saying, can we have a private conversation? We need to talk about the sermons. And so someone is going to have to make a sacrifice in the short term for the sake of addressing what is the thing holding back everyone at the time. And so I just close that off by saying, Jesus' suffering was profoundly purposeful. It was based on the minimum factor of humanity. And if we understand this, then so much supposed sacrifice in the church is actually belittling the sacrifice of Christ, because it's likening irrational suffering to the suffering that Jesus had and calling them both sacrifice, which is a terrible thing to do, rather than saying, the sacrifice that Jesus made was the most practical sacrifice anyone has ever made. So the benchmark for linking suffering and sacrifice with extremely practical actions right now for the sake of the future is very, very strong. And when we ask a church, or when we tell them it's important you address your minimum factor, we are saying essentially the same thing. Now, that this won't be language that necessarily strongly communicates in all contexts, but I just encourage you that, as I've found, it's becoming something more helpful as a way of putting a lot more blood and life into the kind of language we're talking about, and tying it deeply to themes of the Bible, of the Christian life, of Jesus' life himself along the way. And it helps us also address things like the strength-based approach versus, minimum factor-based approach. And some people say, oh, I don't like NCD because it's minimum factor-based. I prefer strength-based approaches. Well, what they don't understand is NCD is both, because in spiritual gifts, it's a strength-based approach. We want you to use your strongest gifts. In the context of the health of the church, it's minimum factor-based, because unless you address that, you won't make progress. So of course, strength-based approaches make progress, because it's better to use your strengths than not use your strengths. Like, that's really obvious. But again, if you talk about strength-based approaches alongside NCD, you're still talking about books on the wrong shelf of the library. They're completely different categories. Because in NCD, we're saying you need both of them, and you need to apply the right one at the right times. And so rather than just simply talking about the fun of strength-based approaches, we reintroduce, for those who don't like minimum factor strategies, say, so you don't like sacrifice either. Is sacrifice part of the Christian life or not? Is it clearly illustrated? Is taking up your cross something to do with the Christian life, whatever that might mean? So again, I just want to offer this in terms of maybe your own reflection about these things, because I think there's a lot more to be considered in this and thought through. And I hope we get a lot smarter generally around all this, but certainly in terms of your own application and work in NCD. Okay, just moving on to the last couple of points here, and we'll see what we get to time-wise. Okay, so the next category for clarification within all of this is the heads, hands, and hearts reality of the church. Some of you may recall my webinar some time back on the 3 spheres of NCD and the idea of how we need to progressively expand people's understanding as they go through the church survey process so that they keep making progress. And this notion begins with the idea that the first sphere is kind of the church sphere, which has an organizational focus. Now, this is not something of our making. This is just out of the research. What tends to happen fairly strongly is that when churches begin the NCD process, they approach their minimum factor in quite an organizational manner. They tend to try to restructure and reorganize things in church life to make it a bit healthier, which is great. And we know progress is made through that. So if that's the default response, then we don't necessarily want to change that. That's great. All we want is some momentum and some progress in the beginning. However, what we can see very clearly right around the globe in significant numbers is that churches, after a number of survey cycles, despite having plenty of room to still become much healthier, tend to stall in their progress with health. It's not that they've become, suddenly saying, oh, we don't think these principles are relevant anymore. Usually they are more sold out to the principles and agree that they make sense because they've experienced some progress. They can feel the difference in their church. There's lots of good things around it, but nevertheless, they start to stall. And so the critical issue is we need to help them expand and say, okay, that's great. You've reorganized some things. Now you need to step out to the level of saying the church is the heads, hands, and hearts of the people. So only by improving the health in the heads, hands, and hearts of the people will you continue to improve the health of the church. And that's a transition that only very few churches make. And so it's a really important role for coaches and practitioners to recognize when that transition is going to have to take place so they begin doing that. Because serious progress can't be made unless you help them expand their NCD process to address their minimum factor at the personal character level. It's the process will top out. We know that will take place. And then they'll feel a bit disillusioned because they know the principles generally make a lot of sense, but now for some reason they're not making more progress. So that's a very important role we have. Now, the take-home practicality around this for the sharpening of our communication, first and foremost, is just simply that we as practitioners need to be doing this in our own heads, hands, and hearts. We can't be specialists that go and advise people on things and are not addressing exactly the same principles in ourselves. Like there's nothing that's more convincing to a church I work with than when I tell them about my own personal discipleship results, or I happen to mention that my children who we homeschooled had the 3-color paradigm as part of their curriculum. They all learned their fruit of the Spirit. They all learned how to grow in that. They learned gifts and all these sorts of things. And they're quite shocked that a consultant coach would actually take the principles that seriously, that they'd actually apply them themselves. So it simply makes sense that we are addressing these things ourselves. But secondarily, as I say, that we are then helping churches realize you will not make any further progress beyond a certain point until we take this next step that begins looking at the minimum factors in your own head, hands, and heart, starting probably with the inner core of the leadership and then gradually working out and helping the rest of the congregation that way. So, of course, the e-tests are available on the website there. Some exciting news. The process of developing those discipleship tools started in about 2002. And it's quite possible that by the end of this year, the 8 discipleship tools will actually all be in place. So this is going to be quite a very, very exciting year from that perspective, which means in that sense, with the church survey there, and then this whole character sphere layer in place, there are lots of options and lots of tools to help people make these transitions along the way. So that's very exciting for particularly Christian and myself after a lot of years of developing these things. So finally, simply as another layer on top of the layer we've just looked at, we then go to the third sphere, which again, presented on before, and this is the community sphere, the all of life sphere. You can have people becoming greater salt and light and living their lives wherever they live and work and go to school and whatever they do, with healthier heads, hands, and hearts, and that's going to be radiating to people around them. But there's still a bit further to go, and that is to help them to understand those principles, not as something that they just do in the church and happen to live out a bit in the world, but the same principles apply 100% in every sphere of their life, wherever they happen to go. But even more than that, the same principles are either helping or, if they're ignored, causing the lives of unchurched and unsaved people to suffer along the way. So the same principles apply to people even before they've made any kind of commitment to Christ. So this transition is a really critical one, for one very practical reason, as I've got here. Even active church members usually spend less than 10% of their waking hours in church organized activities. So if you're trying to change the world through that little window of time where you can try to influence and grow your people and hope that that just radiates out to the rest of the world, it's going to be pretty slow progress, and you're going to have an awful lot of crosswind and things pushing back against you, slowing all of that down. So only when we can find ways of helping people to understand and grow in and embrace the principles wherever they are, in every context, in the workplace, in the home, wherever they happen to be, only at that point can you then expect an enormous increase in the fruitfulness of the church itself as a celebration and mission equipping center in the lives of the people. But at the same time, then that the message of the church is finding so much more fertile ground all around the place in the surrounding communities, because more people are being helped to understand the principles that are governing their lives, whether they like it or not. And so ultimately this leads to community transformation. So we must be clear that community transformation will remain only a dream unless the principles of God's kingdom are brought to life in the everyday world of people, whether they are church people or unchurched people. So that is the logical conclusion of what we're on about as NCD coaches and practitioners, if we want to see the maximum level of fruit come from that. Now, again, I'm very excited to say that the My Oikos project, oikos being the ancient Greek word for household, or in our modern terms, perhaps sphere of influence. The research phase for that particular e-test and project has begun. So I'd strongly encourage any of you that are interested to participate in that. Unfortunately, it's only in English at this initial stage, but jump across the website, check that out. There's a little video there, and there's various things tied to that. But that phase has begun, and two important parts about that project. One is that it is NCD for the everyday. It is the vehicle to help people, church members, unchurched people, whoever, begin to recognize and embody and address and live out the principles wherever they are in their lives. So that's an enormous, when I first talked to Christian about this thing, he was so excited about the whole thing, because for him in the early stages of developing NCD, it was like, that's the logical conclusion that we always wanted to try to get to. So yes, we have to kind of put that piece of the puzzle in place. So it's like NCD for the everyday. The secondary factor is that it also becomes and will become the chief tool for addressing need-oriented evangelism, because there's no more comprehensive way to address need-oriented evangelism than to help every person in the church to see clearly their sphere of influence, to understand the health in their sphere of influence, and then to begin addressing that, because that means that if you have a church of 100 people, you've got many, many hundreds of people in the sphere of influence of that church. And so suddenly, if you can minister to those people on the basis of their actual needs through the everyday lives of your people, that's an enormous step forward in terms of the potential and possibilities and fruitfulness of the church. And we are certainly coming to the end of our time. I get a little bit excited about some of these topics and probably go a little bit longer than I should on some of them. But anyway, I hope you can appreciate the passion that I have for these topics, and how after 20 years, I'm not hanging up the boots at all. And I'm simply looking at how do we make the next 20 considerably more fruitful and more effective. But I'd love to just turn things for a moment to any thoughts or questions anyone has. If you'd like to just perhaps just put them into the chat window, and then I can perhaps just give us a few quick responses to anything that might be of help. Okay, some really great comments in there, even from earlier on. Sorry, I didn't see these coming up at the time. Okay, so just looking back through, I see some other comments there about one in particular relating to the growth in attendance trends. Does this take into consideration the fact that many churches now have more people but attending on a less frequent basis? Simply doing a weekly head count doesn't identify this. This is a very valid question to be asking. And one of the issues, I guess, for us is that if a church says they want to become a very healthy church, if they want to become the fullest expression of the church in their particular context, then that's what they want us to help them with. And that's what we need to be focusing on. So what's interesting is that for churches that are much, much healthier, the changing attendance pattern issue doesn't seem to be anywhere near as much an issue. So people's willingness and desire, it's because frankly, where else can you go and meet with a group of people who are wanting to worship something other than themselves and to connect with God and to feed off the experiences of other people? You can't get that on social media. You can't get that in even non-physical contact places. So what the church is, particularly in the context of gathered worship, remains something that is incredibly unique in the context of the whole of society. So on that basis, we want to be very careful that churches are not necessarily just saying, well, our people just attend a bit less regularly, and maybe that's just the way things are. That would be a very dangerous track to take, to assume that that's the case. But instead to say, well, yes, your people, because of lots of reasons and social media and whatever else, are attending less often. But that does not mean that if you were a healthier church, they would not then want to be attending very often, because why would you not? One gathering of worship a week would not be enough. You'd want two. Like, you would want to be a part of that, to constantly be, being heated up by what's happening in the rest of the world. So, that's a very big topic, but that would be my initial comment on that. We must be very careful that we're not making excuses for changing patterns that are in actual fact very strongly related to the health of our churches, and not just the way it is in society. Gary D, sacrifice might also be understood as work, allocation of resources, time, energy, money, etc. Intentionality of effort. Yes, excellent point. And in a sense, I guess I would view those as many of the things that you must be willing to sacrifice even to work on your minimum factor. So some churches have poor holistic small groups. And sometimes all you have to do is walk into the leadership team and say, can you show me your budget for the development of holistic small groups? And they don't even have a line on there. They don't spend any money on it. It's not a priority at any level. You say, well, it's not surprising. It's your minimum factor. Maybe you need to sacrifice money that you currently spend on certain parts of church life that are already going quite well. And that will feel like a sacrifice, but that's just the very definition of sacrifice, to place it where it needs to go for the greater good along the way. Andy, I typically introduce myself as an ambassador of hope. I love that. That's great. Very, very good. Yeah, toxic hope. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. That's a very good way. Sorry, the topic hope. I read that as toxic. Interesting. That's a connection that I made in my head, and that's actually the way I'd put it. When you don't have balanced hope, is you actually make things more toxic. From Neil, I have hope. Could have been better. Could have been worse. Yes. Very good. Yes, wonderful. Okay, if there's no other questions or comments or such things there, I think I've gotten to the end of the list there. Yeah, thanks so much for making the time. I hope that it's encouraging for you. It's ironic that we've spent a lot of time in this last hour and a half searching, which could make us all very depressed. But the important thing is that we do keep that balance with the gratitude of what has happened. And with that in mind, I'd love to just pray for us all right now as we continue this ministry we're involved in. Jesus, we are so very grateful for the fruit that we can see, the undeniable fruit we can see from the many, many years of laboring in this ministry. And we have all our funny terms and words we use for this, but our desire is, and in certain areas we feel that it is the case, that what we're trying to do is in some modern sense, say the same kinds of things that you were saying right from the beginning, when you tried to lay out and help people understand the kind of life that is compatible with living in this world and is the most fruitful life that would lead to your promised life in all its fullness. I'm so grateful for the time of each of the people in this meeting that they give to this work, and I know the sacrifices that many have to make on a regular basis for the sake of this, and that we might be heartened by your picture of the joy that was set before you, and that we would hold on to that same joy, recognizing these principles are not going away. So if we commit ourselves for another year, another 5 years, another 10 years, they are very unlikely these principles are going to go away, and that much of the toil that we've had will begin to see even greater fruit, that there'll be some multiplication of that fruit that will begin to emerge, particularly as we try to sharpen our speech and to make our yes, yes, and our no, no. And in the midst of all the fogginess and crazy things that are said in much of the world today, that we will be voices that speak the truth as best we possibly can, and that we will make sure that when we leave a group of people having tried to minister to them, that they have heard as clearly as possible your heart and your principles and the way that life works best, and that whatever decisions they make from that point, at the very least, they have been told and they have heard what is important, and that hopefully they will take that on board. So we're so grateful that you are an astonishingly empowering God, and Jesus as the head of your church. Your modeling of empowerment in so many ways is just breathtaking, and that we ourselves would look at what that looks like to become better empowering leaders as coaches and practitioners constantly, that others might be lifted up and be given a higher spot from which they can see what it is that you are already doing, have already done, and what you still want to do. And Yeah, we love you, Jesus, and we're just so grateful that you include us in what you're doing in this world. And we pray all this in your name and for your sake. Amen.